I remember when I was around 12 being very angry at God. And I was, in fact, I was kind of interested in the whole book of Job. Was something that I became almost obsessed with at that time. You know, I was getting into scripture because on my dad's side of the family, they have a lot of evangelical Christians that are like Bible reading Christians. So they were really, I probably have a dozen Bibles around my house that are Protestant Bible, missing the Deuterocanonicals because from that side of the family. So the book of Job was one that I was really fascinated by because I just picked up right away that this was the problem that I was dealing with in terms of my anger with God, that I felt like my mother didn't do anything wrong. She was a good person. She was a righteous person. That my father had left her for another person, and he seemed to be very happy, right? So his life seemed to be blessed, and she was really miserable and sick and really struggling. And that didn't make sense to me. I was like, if my mother didn't do anything wrong, why is she suffering? My father's the one who did something immoral. Why is he not? You know what I mean? It didn't seem like the moral universe didn't seem just, you know? And I saw that that's what Job was about. But I didn't, I was at a time where I didn't think I was spiritually mature enough to appreciate God's answer to Job. I was like, what do you mean? I made all this, so too bad. I mean, that was kind of how I took it. So I really was disappointed by the book of Job. It didn't satisfy my craving. I wanted something more. And I don't think I ever found an answer to that at that time in my life. So it was this sort of question. And then when I got to college, I remember I took a class, believe it or not, it was a psychology of religion class, or maybe it was a philosophy of religion. I forget what exactly it was called. But the person who taught it was an atheist. So he really was, when I look back on it, I'm kind of appalled that this class was really supposed to be an introduction to world religions, and he really used it to proselytize atheism. I didn't get how outrageous that was at the time, because I just thought he's a professor and he knows what he's doing, and I'm just a student. In retrospect, I think it's pretty outrageous. But anyway, he was a pretty staunch atheist, and basically he used the book of Job, right, to make that argument that God is not just. And he gave me that typical atheist argument based on the problem of suffering, that if God is all good, then he can't be all powerful because he allows people to suffer. And if he's all powerful, he can't be all good because otherwise he would stop the suffering. And that made sense to me. So I was like, you're right. So I didn't believe in God anymore. He convinced me. I think there was part of me that really wanted to believe in God still. There was a yearning. I would relate it now, because I've been reading a lot of C.S. Lewis, to that sense of joy, and I do research on joy now. This kind of longing, this desire for the transcendent. I had that, but he did a good job of snuffing that out about as well as he could with that argument. So I didn't have an answer. I didn't have a comeback to the problem of suffering. So I just said, intellectually, I was convinced, even if disappointed, because I was looking for an intellectual answer that would allow me to justify my faith. So I gave up on it. And then that led me into an ascent to the whole academic culture that really conspires against the faith. So whether that's Marx and Feuerbach and seeing faith as this, as an opiate in the masses, as a way of controlling people, or whether it's Freud that sees it as some kind of defense mechanism for coping with early parental traumas, or like Ernest Becker, Denial of Death, which I still think is a great book. I think you can reconcile that with the faith. But the way Ernest Becker talks about religion or any kind of culture as a way of defending against the fear of death, those are the kind of ideas that I began to be introduced to. So I saw religion as just a very elaborate coping mechanism for the fact that life is just hard and difficult, and people yearn for hope, and so they turn to these at the time I would say, oh, these silly superstitious ideas. What's interesting, in my case, it was sort of a blend of the both. It was like, and I find this is true of a lot of the atheists that I know. It's like they have an experience that makes them maybe angry towards God or disappointed in God, and then they find an intellectual reason to justify that. And that's kind of where, so it was like an emotional wound looking for a reason to justify disbelief. And when I found it, it was easy to accept that because I was already angry. And in my evangelizing with atheists, I find that generally holds true. That I find that if I really get to know the atheists pretty well, they usually, underneath the intellectual argument, there's usually a kind of wound, an anger, that can come out, And sometimes I can get somebody who's an atheist to acknowledge that, yeah, I was angry at God, and or the way I usually get at that when I'm talking to atheists is I ask them a really simple question, which is, if, let's say I was able to give you definitive proof that God exists. I know you don't believe that I can't, but let's just say for the sake of argument, I gave you definitive proof. You, in all of your intellectual honesty, and I believe, and I do believe that many atheists are, like I was, truly believe that they're being intellectually honest. That you couldn't discount this evidence, right? Your integrity wouldn't allow you to do that, right? And they'd say, okay, yes. Now, let's say that's true. Some people won't even go that far. They'll just say, no, that'll never happen, so I don't even want to play your analogy game. You know what I mean? But you're hypothetical. I don't even want to get into this hypothetical. But if I can get them to accept the hypothetical, then usually what I find is then I'll say, well, then would you worship God if you knew God existed? And I've never to this day heard an atheist, well, maybe one or two, but almost never heard an atheist say anything other than no. And I say, why? Well, because then God would be evil. Well, why is God evil? And then maybe there's different reasons for why they would say God is evil, but ultimately it ends up going back to this problem of suffering. And sometimes they point to Scripture. There's some pretty tough Scripture that atheists like to point out where God seems to allow some pretty bad things to happen to people. And so they look at those as indications if Yahweh, if the God of the Old Testament, New Testament really exists, then he's not a God worthy of worship. And so even if I had proof that God existed, no, I still wouldn't worship that God. So I think that tells me that just like I was, underneath that is an anger. And if you can get to that anger and work through that anger, that can be very helpful. But I think ultimately you have to get to deal with that problem of suffering.